No?
All
Okay,
right,
Tom.
thanks. And welcome to session 6 of our book club. Again, as a reminder, we're on a recorded line. Would love for this to be as conversational as possible. So feel free to jump in with questions or comments at any point in time. In terms of who we are, we're primarily a collection of, I'd say, kind of Morningstar thought leaders, but with a collection of outside gurus. In terms of where we are, we've now covered off sessions, I'd say part 1 and 2 of the book, and we're going to be talking about what we refer to as our grandchild model, which is really about portfolio construction, in which we're not just concerned with the financial or pecuniary aspect of risk and return, but also factoring in to the degree that a person might have non-pecuniary preferences. You can see we have 4 chapters to go. Depending upon how far we get today, we'll either have just 1 more session or maybe 2 more sessions. Again, if people have questions, please chime in. I feel like it's always good to kind of level set where have we been and where are we going. So this is one of our figures from early in the book that lays out kind of the 3-stage or 3-part model. In part 1, we've covered off the life cycle model, which is helping us to estimate an individual's balance sheet, including the degree to which they have kind of a non-consumption or non-discretionary consumption-based liability, the value of their human capital. These balance sheet elements are getting passed over into what we call our child model, which we talked about, some last week, this net worth optimization. The primary output from the net worth optimization is your target asset allocation for your qualified accounts and your unqualified accounts. And we can even separate that into tax deferred, tax exempt, and taxable. And those 3 lists or vectors or become essentially inputs into our grandchild model, which we'll be developing here over throughout these kind of chapters. So I guess this first chapter, chapter 9, we try to put forth kind of our framework for incorporating non-pecuniary preference is not only into asset prices, but ultimately into how one would think about constructing portfolio when somebody has non-pecuniary preferences or tastes. Of course, not everyone has non-pecuniary preferences or tastes. And that's not to say that they don't necessarily have like a desire to make the world a better place. I think if we take, say, Milton Friedman as an example, Milton Friedman's, view on things would be as I should really just grow my portfolio to the maximum amount possible. And then I can take that money and then use them for any sort of philanthropic desires that I have. Other people, of course, now would like their non-pecuniary preferences to be reflected in their portfolio construction. And we'll elaborate on kind of how we end up doing that. So here is the holistic investor profile that we highlighted back in chapter 2. I'd say we've largely covered everything on the left-hand side of the screen, and then kind of at the far right here, we have kind of the non-pecuniary preferences that investor may or may not have. Back in chapter 2, we discussed how one might evaluate those preferences, and we started off with what we said was admittedly relatively poor calibrating question, but these are the type of questions that we think that the industry needs to develop in terms of digging down on a trade-off between the pecuniary risk and return of a portfolio and the degree to which an individual may or may not have non-pecuniary preferences. Again, so here this is just asking a very simple question about what level of return reduction somebody might be willing to give up in order to have a portfolio that fully reflects what would say is their non-financial or their non-pecuniary preferences. And again, I believe Milton Friedman would go with the first dot, none. I'm not willing to sacrifice any return. And again, what somebody like Milton Friedman would want to do is use the value of their portfolio as they see fit to perhaps encourage various impact themes or help his grandchildren or whatever it happens to be. But other people, of course, as we have seen, for faith-based reasons or values-based reasons, would like to have a portfolio that ultimately reflects their non-pecuniary preferences. Here, this chart we've shown before shows just an example of how one might dig deeper into kind of pitting two things that an individual would like or dislike, starting them in a neutral position of equal importance, and then to the degree that one person prefers a given characteristic over and above another characteristic, they could move said slider away to indicate whether they only somewhat like, say, a characteristic, or perhaps they, feel very passionate and love a given characteristics, or perhaps at the other end of the spectrum, maybe they dislike a characteristics, or maybe they truly despise a given characteristic and really don't want that in their portfolio. But this would be a way for them to calibrate a variety of likes and dislikes. Paul, I'm going to hand it over to you here with this slide, but something that somewhat happens in part 3 of our book is that we, kind of make this move from this holistic theta as being our risk aversion coefficient into lambda space. And Paul, you can maybe talk a little bit about why we do that. But to some degree, we are building on previous works that Paul and I have written and incorporating them into the book. And a lot of the works that go into part 3 have predecessors that were using kind of the lambda risk aversion coefficient. And so we continue to do so here. But with that, Paul, I'll let you take us through the next handful of slides.
Yeah. So, in parts 1 and 2, we focused on constant relative risk aversion, which is, straight out of economic theory. In part 2, in particular, we used the Levy-Markowitz approximation to it, and then pick portfolio and use that to pick mean variance efficient portfolios. But that's not how most of the world really works. As a practical matter, the typical objective function in mean variance analysis is what we're calling the risk adjusted expected return, or RAER, which is the expected return minus lambda over 2 times the variance. And that's used in the CAPM, and actually that's used typically in mean variance optimization software. They will, the software might ask you for what is your risk aversion. So we're going to look at it, create an optimal portfolio here, and in order sort of to map it from one world into the other world, we start off by maximizing the Levy-Markowitz function. That gets us to an optimal portfolio, and then from that we can infer what value of lambda would get you to the same portfolio using the RAER criteria, which is shown there under point number 2. So that's basically how we went about creating the value of lambda, particularly in chapters 10 and 11, which we'll be getting to. Okay, so what we're going to start with is in chapter 9 is we're kind of reintroducing the popularity asset pricing model. I say reintroducing because we introduced it back in 2018 for the first time in a different CFA Research Foundation monograph on popularity. And then more recently, we've we've written a paper that expands on the popularity asset pricing model, or PAPM, in a paper and with some work here, which is shown as being 2021, 2023, but actually our paper is forthcoming in the Journal of Investment Management. And Tom, is that going to be sometime this year? You
Yeah, who's
know?
to say, right? I feel like Journal of Investment Management works pretty fast, so I think it could be Q4 of this year. I would not be surprised if we move into Q1 or something of next year, but we'll
Yeah.
see.
But anyway, yeah. So that's really the first time our model has been presented in a refereed publication like that. Um, Now, the reason we're starting here in chapter 9 with the PAPM is because this is where we introduced the idea of what we call these non-pecuniary preferences, preferences for things other than risk and other than expected return. Now, when we created the PAPM initially, our goal was to create a very general asset pricing model, which incorporates originally incorporates non-pecuniary preferences. That's what we did in the monograph. And then we expanded on it to include disagreements or different expected returns on the same securities across different investors. So that's our JOIM paper that's forthcoming. Um, Here, the reason we're introducing it here is basically to introduce the concept, which we're going to incorporate in chapters 10 and 11. And but here in this equilibrium context, it's going to show how does how do non-pecuniary preferences impact asset equilibrium asset prices. So that's our focus here. We kind of basically start with the CAPM, which is has expected return minus lambda over 2 times variance as the objective function. And we're now going to introduce another term into it, which is the non-pecuniary characteristics and preferences. So here is the matrix algebra behind that. So we're saying is that the way we're going to evaluate our objective function in this model is going to be the portfolio weights times this matrix C, which is our characteristic matrix, which basically provides the level of a characteristic for each and every security. And then so you can see the term to its left is the standard expected return term, and the term to the right is the lambda over 2 times the variance term. Now, if we were to remove the term in the circle, we'd be right back to the CAPM. So this is where we differentiate the PAPM from the CAPM by the introduction of this term in the investor's objective functions.
And so,
Investors care
Paul,
about more than just risk and expected return. They might care about a number of other things, and not surprisingly, actually, a lot of literature has now been written about those other things being ESG factors. These are non-pecuniary factors that investors might care about, and how does caring about ESG factors impact your portfolio, your equilibrium prices? And another way in which ESG factors can impact asset prices is through that they can lead to different opinions about the expected payoffs on different securities. So if a company has, let's say, really good ESG, uh, is really good on ESG in terms of its operations, the idea would be, well, then it should produce a higher output than a similar firm that does poorly on ESG. So pecuniary and non-pecuniary factors are going to come into play here.
and so Paul, I was just going to
Okay.
elaborate a little bit, and you can, so this top objective function. This is, in my opinion, a standard mean variance objective function. If I feel like the portfolio construction kind of objective function that's hiding, I'll say, behind the CAPM, except all investors actually agree according to the CAPM on what the expected returns and risks of all of the securities are. So actually running that optimization is unnecessary because they all arrive at the same result, which is, the market portfolio. And then as you move to equation 9.3 down below, when we have our little subscript I, which is trying to indicate that a given investor would come up with their own view on the risk and return of securities. And then plus they have this new term, this additional term, which is any number of characteristics that they might, love, like, not care about, dislike, truly disdain. And the equilibrium that results in a PAPM world is the result of kind of the collective views on risk and return of the world, as well as the desired and undesired characteristics of the investing public. And again, if anyone has questions before I click the next slide. Sorry to have interrupted, Paul.
No. Okay, so this is what I was just saying earlier about ESG. We distinguish between pecuniary ESG, which are ESG factors that impact risk and expected return, and then non-pecuniary ESG, which has to do with investor preferences. There are some investors, they could care less about ESG. There are other investors to whom it might be very important, and they might be willing to, as Tom showed in his sample question from chapter 2, there might be some investors who might be willing to give up some expected return to get a portfolio that has better use. So to illustrate really how the PAPM works and what implications it has for ESG, is we formed a very simple model. In this model, there's only two stocks, which we're calling one ESG positive and one ESG negative. So the idea is that the one ESG positive, because it has very good ESG practices, produces more output than the ESG negative one, which maybe ignores good ESG practices, or maybe even has poor ESG factors as well. So we're starting off with two investors, the ESG aware and the ESG unaware. Now, in this case, we're going to start with these two investors. We haven't said anything about preferences with these two investors. We're just saying that one investor is unaware of how ESG impacts firms, and the other one is aware of that. Okay, and therefore, what's going to happen is that the ESG aware investor is going to have an accurate forecast about the ESG positive and negative firms, whereas the ESG unaware I think we're actually going to say that the unaware investor actually thinks they're going to have the same expected payout, which is not true. They really do have different expected payouts. So this is illustrating at this point of the illustration, we're just illustrating the idea of differences in viewpoints. And by the way, the first paper that we're aware of that introduced differences in forecasts into an equilibrium asset pricing model was written by Littner in 1969. So in a way, what we're doing is we're kind of just updating that here and explicitly calling identifying the differences in expected payouts due to ESG.
And so it was Littner along with Bill Sharp and Mosine and Trainer that all kind of get credit for the CAPM. And I think it was Littner 1966 that where he had has his version of the CAPM. And then it's, I think, just 2 or 3 years later, I think it's Littner 1969, where he, allows for different kind of views in an equilibrium setting.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take this. Okay, so this you might for those of you that read Morningstar magazine, you might recognize that this graph is done in the style of Morningstar magazine, because actually we just copied and pasted it out of the magazine into the book, and then of course here onto the slide. But what you can see is, this is what happens as a result of one investor having accurate viewpoints and the other one having inaccurate uh, viewpoints, and you can see the difference there in expected return. The tangent, the tangent line there is, the true tangent line. It is tangent to the equilibrium, to the portfolio, taking into account ESG, and and you see the ESG positive. Yeah, so the ESG aware investor actually has a higher expected return than the ESG unaware investor. And we actually have two different frontiers for them, because they each have a different view of the world. So and you can see the difference, that the ESG unaware investor, his efficient frontier is that blue efficient frontier, which is basically narrower from top to bottom than the ESG aware frontier. So he's going to lose out because he doesn't understand how ESG affects expected payoffs. Okay.
And so, Paul, I think the purpose here early on in chapter 9 is to introduce the popularity asset pricing model and demonstrate, when different investors are kind of acting as they see the world, how this leads to kind of different portfolios and different implications on asset prices. But then for the purpose of personalized portfolio construction, I think that's where we kind of pivot to next.
Yeah, but can you go back for a minute to the previous slide, because there's
Sure.
one more thing I want to point out. Notice the market portfolio is not on the efficient frontier.
Just off, but off.
It's off it's off the efficient frontier, and this is because of the differences in viewpoints, and one being accurate and one being inaccurate. Because one of the main points in the CAPM world is that the market portfolio is efficient, and so everyone should hold the market portfolio plus or minus cash to lever it or either delever it or lever it. But here, I mean, to hold the market, nobody should hold the market portfolio here. Okay. Okay, now we're going to expand on this example, and we're going to introduce ESG preferences in it. So since there are 4 possibilities, we created 4 investors. So one is the ESG unaware view, is an unfair view, and has no pecuniary ESG preferences. So investor one just doesn't care about ESG, and doesn't even think it's important, doesn't even think ESG is important in terms of forecasting the payoff of holding the stock. It just had nothing to investor one. Investor two has an unaware or inaccurate view, and has a non-pecuniary ESG preference. So they prefer ESG, but they don't understand how ESG could impact the expected payoffs. Investor three it has it's ESG aware and has no so he's aware of how ESG is affecting things. He has an accurate view, but he has no but he doesn't care about um he has no preference regarding ESG. Now, and then number four is has ESG is ESG where and has a preference. Now, of those four, which of those four should really, from a purely pecuniary point of view, purely from the point of view of like risk adjusted expected return, who should be doing the best? It should be investor three because they do understand how ESG is impacting uh, expected payoffs of the two stocks, but they have no pecuniary preference regarding it.
And then who should be
So
doing worse?
they're yeah. So they should be like in the best place. And yeah.
Right. And
Um
then it's conversely, it's the unaware person that also has a pecuniary preference that you would expect to do the worst.
yes. Yes, that'd be number two. Yeah. Okay. Now this is a kind of an efficient frontier that it's not a mean variance efficient frontier, but it's a kind of efficient frontier. And actually, I got the idea for this frontier from one of the ESG papers. So the idea is to say, okay, the ESG from an ESG aware, if you're ESG aware, then you want to be, then you're going to be on that green curve, uh, which on the vertical axis has non-pecuniary ESG exposure, um, but on the horizontal axis is risk adjusted expected return. It's RAER. It's mu minus lambda over 2 sigma squared. That's what we're measuring there. So the investor with the non-pecuniary preference, that's investor three. Uh, Investor three has the highest possible expected return. I'm sorry, has the highest uh, possible risk-adjusted expected return that's on that curve. But investor number four, who has a non-pecuniary preference, he's also on the green curve. Um, but yeah, but he's on the green curve, but has less risk-adjusted expected return. So the point at the very bottom, the blue point, investor without non-pecuniary has no pecuniary preferences, but is aware. That's our investor three, and then investor four is the other one who has non-pecuniary preferences. So he's willing to give up some risk expect. He's willing to give up some risk adjusted expected return to get um to get more non-pecuniary ESG exposure. So it's a different trade-off, but it's the same idea. It's that the thing it's showing that how if you do have a preference, you're willing to give up risk adjusted expected return in order to get that higher level of non-pecuniary uh, ESG exposure. Okay. All right. Now we just have some bar charts to show how this all sort of works out. So here you have you have the ESG, the number one, the ESG unaware views, non-pecuniary ESG exposures. And it's about 50, it's about 50-50 there. Um, and then you move into this one, number two, different ESG views, but no non-pecuniary ESG preferences. And you can see how you get a lot of that ESG negative stock being held versus, the dark blue, where you're not aware of just this one who's not aware of ESG, how NGT impacts expected payoffs, ends up with a lot of the negative stock. Whereas the ESG aware investor, you can see, ends up, mostly with the ESG positive stock. Okay, and now we're going to show all four investors together and how they differ in terms of what they hold. So we've talked about how number three in particular there has a positive stock. Number four is ESG aware and has an ESG preference, so they hold more of the positive stock than would be would be optimal otherwise. Yeah. And so you can see from this chart just how they differ. The ESG unaware with no ESG preferences ends up with just over 100% in the ESG negative stock. Okay. All right.
All right, and so that is kind of the end of chapter 9, and I guess I don't know if people had questions related to what they read. Again, I think stepping back a little bit, chapter 9 was introducing, the popularity asset pricing model, and I would just say a theoretical, method for ultimately constructing a portfolio, albeit in these very simplified examples, using what you might think of as individual, stocks. We've showed how different investors with different views and different preferences or tastes would arrive at different personalized portfolios. And now in chapter 10, we're going to take a step towards a more realistic situation in which an investor would have, they would be presumably not just working with a handful of stocks, they would probably be investing in a variety of possible funds. And that's going to motivate us moving kind of out of the individual security world into what I think of sometimes as the fund of funds setting. And then we're also going to move at some point here out of kind of that total return objective function that Paul was showing, eventually into a tracking error type world in which there is a benchmark of sorts, often a multi-asset class benchmark that comes down, I sometimes say, from the gods. And the goal within an alpha tracking error framework is to then outperform either to match the performance of that benchmark with no tracking error and essentially low to no fees. Again, at the moment, we haven't really introduced the concept of fees yet, but and then if you can forecast alpha, ideally you'd like to outperform. And so I would say that fund of funds optimization and alpha tracking error optimization are both variations of mean variance optimization. In an alpha tracking error optimization, again, the target, the strategic asset allocation, the policy portfolio, whatever you want to call it, that's come down, from the gods. I often use the word, fund of funds. What this means is that our change variable in the optimization is not how much you're allocating to each asset class, but rather it's how much you're allocating to each of the funds in question. And then, of course, kind of per the last bullet point here, it's not really a bullet point, but via the framework that Paul was just talking about in the PAPM, we can also introduce or include that non-pecuniary benefit term in the optimization to arrive at what I would argue is a truly tailored or personalized portfolio. Chapter 10 starts off with this exhibit that I've loved over the years, and I should say that I've somewhat, borrowed or was inspired for this exhibit, by Barton Waring, and a piece that he wrote with several other authors. And in this case, everything that is in blue, corresponds to asset classes. And there is a blue efficient frontier where each point on the efficient frontier is maximizing the expected return of the asset classes for a given level of risk. And so those are efficient asset mixes on the blue efficient frontier. And then I kind of have, if my pointer will cooperate, I'll put it right over this origin spot. Here you have an efficient mix, and to kind of briefly explain alpha tracking error optimization in words is that, one, if there was a passive investment option, passive mutual fund, passive ETF, passive separate account, I could more or less replicate the performance of the target asset allocation, and I would have, low to no expected tracking error. For those that feel that they can find funds that can add positive alpha over time after fees, there's this new green implementation frontier where each point on the efficient frontier, on this implementation frontier, is maximizing the portfolio's expected alpha for a given level of tracking error relative to that target asset allocation policy portfolio. And again, I'd just say happy to take questions along the way. There's kind of different kind of ways in which we could have explained this. This first jump that I'm going to try to make, Paul showed a formula that was very similar to equation 10.1, which you might think of as the standard mean variance optimization type objective function. The subscript here in this is all K's, which is just indicating that what the optimizer is doing is it's changing the allocation to the various asset classes in an attempt to maximize this objective function. In a fund of fund setting in which I'm not allocating to asset classes or individual investments, I'm now changing how much I'm allocating to the different funds that make up my opportunity set. And that takes us to equation 2. And I should highlight, I'm still not in the alpha tracking error world here. I'm just demonstrating that I could have a different change variable. Rather than changing weights to asset classes, I change weights to the manager's subscript M. And then that's going to produce, as it's changing the allocations of HM, it's trying to increase the alpha of the portfolio. It's trying to increase the return from the different asset classes. And then it's trying to minimize risk, which is the risk associated with my asset class exposures and the risk associated, the idiosyncratic risk or residual risk associated with the individual managers. Now, I can, of course, expand that equation, and I'll go back for a second. And so I'm just taking this equation, equation 10.2, and we're now, just as Paul had done, adding in the additional non-pecuniary benefit term. And if I keep on going, I eventually want to, move into the alpha tracking error framework. And this, I've done that by eliminating some terms, and maybe I'll pivot back and forth between the previous equation. But so here in alpha tracking error space, I still have my alpha term, but the term that was associated with the return associated with the asset classes, that's gone away in this format. I still care about the non-pecuniary benefit. And now this penalty for risk is now specific to the penalty for active risk, or we could think of this as total tracking error. There are two flavors of tracking error in the alpha tracking error framework. One is, I call it asset allocation misfit risk, and that's the idea that the effective or implied or inferred asset allocation of my portfolio doesn't perfectly match HK, which is essentially my target that, again, in my world has now come down from the gods. And then the other component of tracking error is coming from the residual or idiosyncratic risk of the managers. You can see that we've allowed for two different lambdas here, or risk aversion coefficients. And then this is subscript A, this is subscript M. Again, it's not quite clear why one would prefer one form of tracking error over another. But again, by having separate lambdas, one has the ability to calibrate whether or not they have a higher or lower aversion to a certain source of tracking error. And
Tom, could you go back to
absolutely,
and go back again, and let's take a look there. So what's happening here is kind of a mathematical sleight of hand, sort of, in that everything that's relative to, just to asset allocation goes away when you move to equation 10.4, and the justification for that, I mean, the way this works is that if you assume that the asset allocation target is on the mean variance efficient frontier in asset allocation space, then it turns out that there's some canceling of terms, and that this non-pecuniary, that this the the terms that are related only to asset allocation, there's one that falls out from the previous slide, and that this one and that the asset allocation misfit is, if you go back to the previous slide, it was this total asset allocation risk, but now it's misfit. It's been changed to misfit risk. So yeah, so here you have asset allocation that drops out, and instead of asset allocation variance, instead you have what we called it, asset allocation yeah, to the next slide is asset allocation misfit risk.
and my recollection is that in the appendix of chapter 10, I think we demonstrate and derive how that happens. And then I know for sure in this paper that we're referencing here from 2022, which was in the Journal of Investing, the appendix of that paper also demonstrates the math. And so now we're about to enter an applied example that is based off of that Journal of Investment piece, although we modified it substantially and kind of redid it for the purposes of the monograph. An example that includes ultimately 6 investors. We've introduced the idea of 6 different characteristics for which 5 of the 6 have preferences around those characteristics. And then we introduced kind of 9 different funds that they could ultimately allocate to along the way. And so in this chapter 10 example, we've assumed that all 6 investors have the same target strategic asset allocation. That could have come out of some of the models that we've discussed, but for this purposes, it doesn't really matter where that came from. It's just here, and we have it. Here are the 9 funds. It's really 8 funds. Fund I is just cash, essentially. And you can see the 9 total funds, or 8 funds here. The equity funds, you can see there's a variety of different kind of alphas and levels of residual risk or idiosyncratic risk. And all of the equity funds over here, these are the style exposures. So this is sometimes what we might call matrix X, representing, the exposure of each fund to the asset classes, where we're using an asset class, I'll call it risk factor model, to highlight how preferences drive or lead to personalized portfolios. We've tried to, simplify or kind of standardize on certain variables. So in this case, the equity funds all have the same assumed effective asset allocations. And then similarly, the bond funds all have the same assumed effective asset allocation. And again, the goal of all 6 investors is to implement the target. And they all, in this case, they could have all had different views on the fund alphas. They could all have different views on the residuals, as well as different views on the exposures of the funds. But again, to focus in on how preferences drive personalized portfolio construction, we made it that all 6 investors share the same view on alpha, residual risk. They all have the same view on asset class exposures, and they all are targeting the same target asset allocation. And then each fund has different exposure to the 6 different assumed characteristics here, which are gender equality, green energy, board diversity, alcohol, tobacco, and guns. So the first 3 things you might think of as kind of being impact-oriented themes. The last 3 are kind of vices that people might have or seek to avoid. And again, the framework allows for any number of characteristics that a given person would care from. Here we just have 6 characteristics, but this could be 100 different characteristics with which somebody might actually have kind of a view. And now what this slide, exhibit 10.4, is showing is the preferences of the different people. And so this, earlier on in the equation where we introduced the non-pecuniary term, it had 3 that entire term had 3 elements to it. One was just the whole, like how much was getting allocated to a given fund or manager with the subscript M. It had a capital letter C. So if I go back, attempt to go back, that was just the characteristic matrix of each fund's exposure to the different characteristics in question. And then the final element of that expression was the degree to which a given investor has specific preferences. And so in our world, investor 1, as an example, they have no non-pecuniary preferences. So the value is essentially 0, which essentially means the term in its totality will ultimately go away. Here, maybe to contrast investor 2 and investor 3, both of these people, by assumption, they like impact. And you can see that, this has been calibrated perhaps using the sliders that I've shown a couple of times throughout our different talks. This person loves impact. And so by calibration of using something like the sliders, they end up at a higher, value. And again, you get to see that we introduce, investor 4 is faith-driven, investor 5 is anti-gun, and investor 6 kind of has a variety of preferences. And then we can ultimately solve the objective function based on the different inputs that I've put forth thus far and determine what is the optimal personalized portfolio for each of these investors. And so this is kind of the output after running said optimization. And so in this top panel, panel A, this is just the allocation to the different funds. And so this is, I'm highlighting maybe investor 1 has no preferences. And down here, I kind of want to emphasize that they end up, with an alpha of all the alphas on this list of all 6 investors. They have the highest ultimate alpha. And they also end up with a low, it's not the lowest, but they have, a low amount of tracking error. And so, they have a value of, for the objective function of 0.14. Looking here at the investor that loves impact, and then again, just trying to, pick this out, you can see that, they are allocating heavily to the impact fund higher than the person that just likes this, and much more than the person that didn't have a preference. And then if we maybe go down to the impact bond fund as an example, again, that person that loves impact has the highest level here. Again, they're giving up some level of alpha, but they are also acquiring positive utility by having a portfolio that is tilting towards things that they, in this case, I guess, love. Other investors can derive utility from moving away from things they dislike, etc. Here, this is just showing panel C and panel D. And I think kind of the interesting thing here is, again, just to look at the ultimate exposures that investors maybe 1, 2, and 3 end up having, at least on 3 of the characteristics. We could look at any characteristic that anyone perhaps wants, but should have turned my Teams off. But here, in terms of the impact themes of gender inequality or gender equality, green energy, and board diversity, the person that loves these impact themes ends up with, on a relative basis, high levels of exposure to these items. And again, is ultimately receiving what we would say is a kind of a utility maximizing portfolio for them. I definitely should have turned my Teams off. Somebody's messaging me. At the end of chapter 10, again, I like graphical illustrations. Again, you get to compare that all 6 investors, the person, investor 1 with no preferences, plus the 5 that have a variety of preferences, all end up with personalized different levels of exposure to the non-pecuniary characteristics that they either liked or disliked, and all end up with, again, portfolios that are maximizing the given objective function. And this really kind of concludes, well, maybe one more slide. I'm about to conclude chapter 10, and I think we'll wrap up for the day, and I hope some people have some questions. At the end of chapter 10, we draw an actual alpha tracking error implementation frontier. And again, I really like this illustration. Paul, I think you're the one who came up with this. But investor 1, the one and only investor in the 6 investor example that has no preferences, and they're strictly focused on the pecuniary nature of expected return and risk, they end up on the efficient frontier. The other 5 investors, due to their preferences, will be to some degree off of that expected alpha tracking error implementation efficient frontier. And so that concludes, I'd say, chapter 10. And I guess our reading assignment for next week will be chapter 11. And I think it would be, depending upon how fast that goes, good to get into chapter 12. It maybe makes sense to break that up into 2 different sessions. But again, so that everybody's prepared to discuss, please read chapter 11 and 12 for next week. But before we look forward to next week, I guess, are there any questions relative to the creation of a personalized portfolio that reflects one's pecuniary views as well as their non-pecuniary preferences with a tailored, personalized portfolio? Well, hearing none, I'll go ahead and conclude. Thank you all for joining, and I look forward to seeing everybody next week.